For years, people believed that Jeffrey Epstein's story was over. The man was dead, the headlines had faded, and then, almost overnight, the files were back in the news. Politicians began arguing on camera. A former British prince was arrested. Cabinet officials were subpoenaed. Millions of people online demanded answers to questions that, officially, were supposed to have been closed years ago. So why is a case that seemed finished suddenly dominating the conversation again? Why does one man's name keep resurfacing, year after year, forcing presidents, prime ministers, and members of Congress to respond? To understand what's happening today, we first have to go back to where it all began. Jeffrey Epstein was, on paper, a financier. He ran a small, secretive investment firm and cultivated an image of extraordinary wealth, though the actual source of his fortune was never fully explained. He had no formal background in finance to speak of, and yet somehow he managed to convince some of the wealthiest people in the world to trust him with their money, and, more importantly, with their time. What made Epstein unusual wasn't just his money, it was his access. Over decades, he built relationships with prominent figures in finance, science, academia, entertainment, and politics. He hosted dinners and gatherings at his Manhattan townhouse, one of the largest private residences in New York City. He owned a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a ranch in New Mexico, and property in Paris and Palm Beach. He funded scientific research, donated to universities, and positioned himself as a patron of ideas, rubbing shoulders with Nobel laureates and heads of state alike. That web of relationships is exactly why the case has never simply been about one man. It's about the ecosystem that surrounded him, the flights on his private jet, the introductions he made, the doors his wealth and social standing opened. That access and the credibility it bought him is central to understanding why the case still matters today. Because the questions people keep asking aren't just about Epstein himself, but about who around him knew what when they knew it, and what, if anything, they did about it. Epstein's criminal history stretches back to the mid-2000s. In 2005, police in Palm Beach, Florida, began investigating allegations that he had sexually abused underage girls at his home. That investigation led to a 2008 plea deal negotiated with federal prosecutors, in which Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution, including from a minor. He served just over a year in county jail, much of it on work release. That deal has been widely criticized ever since, and in 2019 it triggered the resignation of the federal prosecutor who approved it, after renewed scrutiny of how lenient it had been. The case resurfaced in dramatic fashion in July 2019, when federal prosecutors in New York arrested Epstein on new sex trafficking charges. This time, prosecutors alleged a broader trafficking operation involving multiple victims over several years. Epstein pleaded not guilty. Weeks later, on August 10, 2019, he was found dead in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. New York City's chief medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging. That official ruling has never changed. It's worth being precise here. Conspiracy theories about Epstein's death have circulated widely online for years, but no official investigation, medical review, or court finding has overturned the ruling of suicide. Those theories remain in proven speculation, not established fact. And that distinction matters, because much of what follows in this story depends on being able to separate the two. Epstein's death did not end the case. If anything, it opened a new phase. His co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, was later convicted on federal charges related to sex trafficking and remains in prison. Dozens of Epstein's victims pursued civil litigation, both against his estate and against institutions accused of enabling him. Court filings, deposition transcripts, and flight logs from Epstein's private jet were gradually made public through these lawsuits, revealing new names and details year after year. Survivors, many of whom had waited decades to be heard, continued pushing publicly for accountability, not just for Epstein, but for anyone who might have participated in or ignored his abuse. That persistence, more than any single revelation, is why the case never faded from public life the way most old scandals eventually do. Which brings us to the current controversy, the one dominating headlines through the summer of 2026. In November 2025, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a law that received overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed by President Trump. It required the Attorney General to release the government's files on Epstein in a searchable, downloadable format, with limited exceptions for material that could compromise an active investigation or expose victims. It sounded, at the time, like a turning point, a bipartisan commitment to full disclosure. What's happened since has been anything but simple. The Justice Department missed its original deadline. When it finally began releasing documents in early 2026, officials described the release as massive, millions of pages, along with video and image files. But much of what was actually made public arrived heavily redacted. The department has said it withheld a substantial portion of the material entirely, citing the need to protect victims' identities and the integrity of ongoing matters. That explanation has satisfied almost no one. Survivors, advocates, journalists, and members of Congress from both parties have argued that redactions have gone far beyond what's necessary to protect victims, and that they instead shield the names of powerful associates. That argument moved from public complaint to federal courtroom. A journalist covering the story sued the Justice Department, arguing that officials were violating the new transparency law by over-redacting the files. A federal judge agreed, at least in part, ordering the department to either release additional unredacted material or justify, document by document, why it needed to stay sealed. The Justice Department pushed back, telling the court it already complied with the law and offering instead to let the judge review some material privately, behind closed doors. That standoff between the court demanding transparency and the department insisting it has done enough is still playing out. Meanwhile, other threads of the story kept multiplying. In February 2026, newly disclosed material became the basis for one of the most startling developments yet: the arrest of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, formerly Prince Andrew, by British police on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He was released without charge, pending further investigation, and has denied wrongdoing throughout. It marked the first arrest of a senior member of the British royal family in centuries, and underscored something important about this story. Its consequences are not confined to the United States. Back in Washington, congressional committees have spent much of 2026 compelling testimony from a long list of prominent figures with past ties to Epstein, some willingly, some under subpoena, as lawmakers try to determine what officials and associates knew, and whether any of them require further scrutiny. State-level investigators have also entered the picture. Officials in New Mexico, where Epstein owned a ranch, have pressed for access to federal records as part of their own inquiry, and have publicly clashed with the Justice Department over what they've been allowed to see. So why has this become such a flashpoint in 2026 specifically? Partly it's timing. A law demanding transparency collided with a government reluctant to fully deliver it, and that gap between promise and execution is, by itself, newsworthy. Partly, it's the sheer volume of new names and documents entering the public record through arrests, lawsuits, and testimony, each one reigniting attention. And partly it's political. Epstein's case touches individuals across the political spectrum, which means neither party can fully control the narrative, and that uncertainty keeps the story alive in a way a more one-sided scandal might not. That brings us to the central debate, and it's worth laying out both sides fairly. Those demanding fuller disclosure argue that transparency was the explicit will of Congress, expressed in a law passed almost unanimously, and that the public, especially Epstein's victims, deserves to know the full scope of who was involved in his network. They point to the scale of the redactions and ask why material about correspondence discussing disturbing conduct would need to stay hidden if the goal is genuinely to protect victims rather than protect reputations. Officials defending the current approach raise different concerns. They argue that release of unredacted material could expose victims to renewed trauma or public identification against their wishes, could compromise ongoing investigations, and could implicate individuals who were never charged with any crime, raising serious due process and privacy questions. Naming someone in a document doesn't establish guilt, and officials have warned that releasing unverified allegations wholesale risks doing real harm to people who may have done nothing illegal. Both of these positions rest on legitimate concerns: victim protection and government transparency, and the tension between them is exactly why the legal fight has proven so difficult to resolve. Inevitably, a story with this much attention and this many gaps in public information has become fertile ground for speculation online. Social media discussion of the Epstein case is enormous, and not all of it is accurate. Unverified lists of alleged associates circulate constantly, often mixing names that appear briefly in flight logs or contact books, which prove only that someone knew Epstein or once shared a flight with him, not that they participated in any wrongdoing, with names tied to substantiated allegations backed by testimony or documentary evidence. Viral claims about the files, some sourced from genuine reporting and others fabricated entirely or taken wildly out of context, spread across platforms faster than journalists or fact-checkers can keep up. That's a genuine problem, because the consequences of getting it wrong are real. Being named in a document, a contact book, or even a leaked email doesn't equal guilt, and treating it that way, online instantly, without context, can cause serious harm to people who were never charged with a crime and may have done nothing wrong. At the same time, dismissing every claim as baseless conspiracy talk risks doing the opposite kind of harm, discouraging legitimate scrutiny of a case that, by any measure, involved real institutional failures. This is a case where the gap between what's confirmed and what's merely alleged has become one of the story's defining features. And it's a gap worth paying close attention to every time a new claim appears in your feed. The broader impact of all this extends well beyond one man's legacy. For many, the slow, contested release of the Epstein files has become a test case for how much the public can actually trust official transparency processes, even when the law explicitly demands them. A nearly unanimous act of Congress was supposed to settle the disclosure question. Instead, it produced a fresh legal battle over redactions, which itself has become a story about whether institutions follow through on their own promises. That, on its own, feeds a broader erosion of public trust, a sense shared across the political spectrum that powerful people and powerful institutions play by different rules than everyone else. The case has also renewed conversations about how institutions, legal, financial, academic, royal, allowed a convicted sex offender to retain influence and access for as long as he did, and what accountability should look like for those who benefited from that access without ever facing charges themselves. And for survivors, the ongoing fight over these documents is not an abstract political battle. It's a continuing, deeply personal effort to have their experiences acknowledged and, they hope, to see meaningful accountability extend to anyone who enabled Epstein's abuse, a process that, more than 6 years after his death, still hasn't reached a clear conclusion. Years after Jeffrey Epstein's death, the case continues to raise difficult questions, not only about one man, but about power, accountability, transparency, and justice. Whether future disclosures answer those questions or create new ones remains to be seen. Until then, the Epstein story is far from forgotten. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more in-depth investigations into the world's biggest crime stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.